was what we left off with. Remember that we're discussing the development west of the Appalachian Mountains between 1815 and around 1860. I'm going to take you a little bit into the 1870s today, so we're going to kind of expand on it a little bit. Before we get into this, though, let's maybe backtrack a little bit, and since you've done the reading, why 1815? Why is that a significant year? Why does your textbook chapter author decide 1815 makes sense to begin this discussion of the development of the Appalachians, or the development of the interior of the United States west of the Appalachians, based on your reading? Recall? 1815. Well, in American history, what's going on? You know, where are we?
War of 1812.
War of 1812 has ended in victory for the United States, victory for Britain.
Victory for us. Well, I mean, kind of.
Usually considered pretty much a stalemate.
Yeah.
That term status.
What
What is it called? Yeah, well, Jackson went down and tore the place up. The war was already over anyway, right? The 1815 is generally this period after the United States has won its kind of, verification that it was an independent state, right? But for the most part, pretty much a stalemate. How about in Europe? What's going on in Europe?
After the fall of Napoleon.
Okay, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and so peace, a little bit of peace takes place there. Okay, so the global economy is really what he's kind of looking at. He's looking at the global economy because remember, as I said earlier, the emphasis in the chapter is on the development of inter-regional trade, really the development of regions in the first place, agricultural and production regions west of the Appalachians. It's also about the interaction, the spatial interaction or trade connections that develop between those three regions, the Northeast, the West, or the Northwest, and the South. And then on a different scale, this is geography, we always look at different scales, right? On a different scale, you've got global trade going on. And everything that's being produced in the United States isn't being consumed in the United States. In fact, it's a time when the global export markets really begin to take off and affect the United States, so that the export of commodities from whatever region, let's say from the Northwest, the Great Lakes region, the export originally, the exports couldn't get going very well because the area had to be settled in the first place. The agricultural regions developed, and initially agriculture is fairly subsistence oriented, and then we see the development of transportation systems that allow farmers to export their commodities from outside of the region, not just outside of the region to like the Northeast, but beyond to England, right? And so we'll talk about some of the changes in global trade policies that will affect this. So exports of commodities, and exports of commodities from the South, of course, cotton. Much of the cotton was bound for the textile mills of England. Right? So it was a global trade, and that global trade had a huge impact on the development of these regions. Okay, so let's move on. So this was kind of the last slide we looked at. I think we pretty much got through it. Just recall that I was talking about wage rates and differences between wage rates in the Great Lakes region, the old Northwest, and the cotton plantation South during this period. And in both areas, land and the price of land really wasn't much of an issue. If you could, most farmers could get access to land It was a matter of labor that prevented them from expanding into much larger operations. In the north, or north of the Ohio River, agricultural labor was free, and it was mostly family-based. So farmers couldn't really expand much in terms of their acreage until after the Industrial Revolution. And of course, the reason for that is because you would begin to get some new forms of what we might call mechanization, sort of early types of mechanization. And that would actually occur prior to 1860 a little bit. In the South, the labor costs were very, very high because you had continual activity in production of cotton. The plantation system required year-round work, and so the labor wasn't family-based. It was based on slavery, and which is a very expensive, the most expensive form of labor in terms of the costs. But it was probably the only way that cotton prior to mechanization would have been produced and economically lucrative for the planters. Okay, so the big differences that had developed between the North and the South were based on labor costs, and these were pre-industrial, pre-mechanization labor costs. And those would affect, of course, the opportunities for industrial development in cities. You know, I guarantee this is somebody else in another room flickering it back and forth. Anyway, those were the issues that, so the result, of course, by 1860 was that you have Chicago developing, on the Great Lakes, and you have all these industrial cities developing by 1860 in the Middle West. And in the South, it's still very rural. Population densities are really low. There aren't any major manufacturing cities at all. So there was a very, very disparate pattern of geography, economic geography between the Middle West and the South by 1860. We're going to talk a little bit more about transportation now. The transportation systems that are developing due to this. This is the last, the yellow handwritten slide. So transport and profitability of staples. Remember staples? Doesn't refer to those little things you can make paper with, or the franchise that sells paper and stuff. But it's staples, meaning staple crops. In the Middle West, earlier we were talking about wheat. Wheat is the staple. It's the export staple of the farmers in the Middle West. It's not to say that they didn't produce milk, they didn't produce pork, they didn't produce other things. They did. But wheat was the primary crop that could withstand shipment and was actually marketed internationally. So it was the important staple of the northern tier of states prior to 1860. The southern economy is, of course, based primarily on cotton and tobacco, both crops that had a very different perishability and durability in terms of transport. So let's talk about what we mean by that. So a crop that, or a staple that is perishable, what does that mean? Perishable. Spoil. It will spoil. Okay? In the case of wheat, how could shipping wheat, how is that perhaps a problem? I mean, how you think of wheat? Well, is it going to spoil over a week or two?
It's wet.
It gets wet. Yes. Wheat gets wet, and if you're moving it by river and ocean, it's going to get, and not necessarily wet, but it gets moist, and it gets moist enough that it'll sprout. Okay, it'll begin that process of germination. Right? Just by chance, okay, if you've followed any of the development of the craft beer industry and microbreweries around here, in Stillwater we've got a craft brewery. and they produce a lot of their beer from grains produced right here in Oklahoma. Well, what are the components of beer? Well, it's yeast, barley, right? The types of grain. Barley can be wheat. What else can it be? Hops. Okay, then you add hops, for flavoring and that sort of thing. It could also be rye. Right? Rye, wheat, very similar. Barley looks similar. You can probably make it with other grains on it. But those are the three primary beer-producing grains. And what does the grain have to undergo before it's fermented and turned into the mash that becomes beer?
Germination.
It has to go through germination. It has to go through a process that they call malting, right? So they malt that grain, and the way that they do it is they shoot it with steam, moisten it real carefully. It's a very controlled system. Then they allow it to cool, and then they don't heat it up too much so that it dies. But they do that gradually, and eventually it starts to germinate. It doesn't sprout a little piece of green sprout or anything, but it begins to swell and begins to germinate, and the proteins change and the sugars change inside the grain. So it undergoes that process of germination, and then they shut that off, and then they begin to process it into the fermentation process. So the point here is you can't simply take wheat and package it up in a canvas or burlap sack or something and ship it very easily without it germinating, without it ruining. And if you've ever seen grain that sours or begins to ferment and sprout, it's a nasty stuff. But anyway, so what do they have to do? What do they have to do to this perishable commodity in order to ship it? Well, you could dry it perhaps, but in most cases, in the case of wheat and other small grains, basically mill it. Okay, they mill the grain in flour. Flour, on the other hand, can be packaged at a lower amount of moisture, and it doesn't have the natural germination process. So milling the wheat is one way to, first of all, cut down on the bulk and the weight, volume. Turning that wheat into flour allows you to package it and actually ship it a lot more efficiently. Okay? That means that the mills have to be fairly close to the farms. The mills have to be close to wherever the farms are sending the grain. So milling of wheat becomes an important manufacturing or processing activity at the location where the grain would be shipped by either riverboat or lake going ship. So milling becomes an important agriculturally oriented food processing industry in association with the wheat producing areas of the northern states. Okay, so it's perishable, it has a high amount of weight, it's high bulk, but it has to be processed. And if it is processed into flour, flour can be exported. And the flour is a fairly durable commodity. It's has a long shelf life. It's not nearly as risky to ship as just raw grain. In the South, in the Cotton Belt, well, let's maybe take the tobacco region of Virginia and North Carolina first, and later Kentucky and Tennessee. Tobacco is something that's harvested in summer or fall, and then what do they do with tobacco after they harvest it? Tobacco leaves. They dry it. It's cured, and it can be cured in a couple of different ways. It can be dried, or it can be cured with heat, very low heat inside tobacco barns. And then that curing process, which takes place on the plantation itself, there's not any need for shipping it to big warehouses and that sort of thing. So each farm produces its own cured tobacco. That cured tobacco is then fairly ready to go to market. It can be shipped across the Atlantic for the most part after it's cured. Cotton is even easier once it's harvested and ginned. Okay, and remember that the innovation that allowed the type of cotton that we understand, that we think of as cotton, green seed cotton, the innovation that allowed cotton to become a very lucrative plantation crop in the South was the cotton gin, and that was introduced in the 1790s. So, right after the American Revolution, right after the Constitution, the cotton boom began in South Carolina and Georgia, and the demand for cotton land was such that there was a real strong push westward in the southern states to open up new lands, new cotton lands. And the production of cotton, after it's picked, after it's ginned or cleaned, it has the seeds removed. After that, the cotton is put in a press, and it was pressed into standard sized bales. A bale of cotton is actually about the same size as this table. Okay, has anybody seen a bale of cotton? It's about the same size as this table in terms of circumference. Stands usually about that high. It's about that long, about that wide, and about that high. And that is compressed cotton, and it usually weighs around 500 pounds. It's kind of a standard size. Now they compressed it into that sort of cube, sort of rectangular cube, and then typically would wrap it with a burlap or something, and then it was tightly wired. So it was a very tight wired commodity. Some kind of interference going on. And the thing about the cotton bales was that plantations measured productivity by the number of bales that they produced per year. But moving, and it was a very valuable commodity, very valuable product. Moving the cotton was no problem because cotton didn't rot. It wasn't a food item. Once it was packed, once it was ginned and packed, it was pretty much ready to go to the textile mill to be loomed or spun and loomed and that sort of thing. So it was both of the plantation type products, cotton and tobacco. Those were the exports of the plantations. They certainly weren't the only products of the plantations, because plantations, generally fed themselves. But those two products that were shipped out could pretty much go worldwide. And most of them, of course, went to England and to other, especially the tobacco it was going all over the place. But Virginia tobacco and North Carolina tobacco were in great demand in Europe. Southern American cotton was in great demand in the textile mills of England. So those products didn't need any processing to speak of in a city in the South. Therefore, that's one of the primary reasons why the development of urban places in the South was so slow and so meager until after the Civil War. Okay, after the arrival of transportation and some manufacturing. Okay. You might notice here on the notes, it's food products from the Midwest require processing. I guess it's a little quicker way to say it. And cotton and tobacco were largely controlled by merchants in New York City, but they were largely shipping to Europe primarily. So the needs for manufacturing and urban development that go hand in hand were stronger in the Northwest, that is the Great Lakes area. Transport costs were fairly high early, but in the South, transport costs were much lower and processing wasn't needed. So there was little need for manufacturing organization, just to summarize. Now, maps, some visuals. Here we have roughly about the same time, 1860, the end part of your chapter, 1825. Why 1825? Because that's a really important year for big changes in American transportation infrastructure. So we have two things on the map. It may be kind of hard for you to see from the classroom. The blue hashed lines are canals, and the red lines are steamboat routes, basically river routes. We can say a few things about these routes. Number one, canals existed long before 1825. Right? Canals were important, particularly, and I'm going to give you some readings next week about the development of the canals from the eastern cities. Canals had been very important in Europe. So Americans, around 1800, were thinking, what we really need is some way to connect the Atlantic coast cities with the interior, with farms in the interior. And the difficulty was that how do you get across the mountain range with canals? Because in Europe, much of Europe was connected by canals. And those canals weren't all dug by hand. They weren't all original routes that were human produced. Many of the canals, as with those in the United States in 1825 and later, the canals were simply improved parts of rivers. They were improved channels of rivers. And even the Erie Canal, which you've probably learned about a lot since, second, third grade, something like that. The Erie Canal itself is an improvement of the Mohawk River, which goes through this big wide valley in western New York, connects up with the Hudson River around Albany. So the Erie Canal was the most significant one, not because it was so long, and it was longer than most of the other ones that had developed at this time. It was significant because it was a connection between the Great Lakes and the Hudson Valley. Okay? Now, the Hudson Valley, as you may know, and you will know from your Charles Royce map, the Hudson Valley is this glaciated, a glacial trough. It's like a straight, big, U-shaped valley, massive valley, that allows the Hudson River to be very deep. It's in fact a tidal river, over 100 miles inland from New York City. The Hudson River then allows really large ocean-going vessels to come right on into New York. The Hudson Valley then has this connection with the Erie Canal, the old Mohawk River, and so that is a water transport connection to Lake Erie. And with connections of subsequent canals that would allow the connection of the lakes, the Great Lakes, the Erie Canal's opening, 1825, allowed the expansion of agricultural settlement into the entire periphery of the Great Lakes. And most of that would be eventually shipped through the Erie Canal Hudson system. And of course, the city that's going to benefit the most from that freight traffic is New York City. 1780, New York City was not the largest city in the United States. And if you think about New York City always being dominant, it was pretty dominant in a lot of ways, but after the Erie Canal was opened, after the Erie Canal became online, then New York City did become predominant as the real entrepot or trade center of not only the Northeast, but the Middle West. The other things that you see here, you see, of course, steamboats going up and down the coast, and that's something that develops pretty early. Now, steamboats themselves are really not a big innovation in the 1800s. Steam power on smaller boats was experimented with in the early 1700s, maybe even earlier, but you begin to see them in Europe in the early, mid-1700s. What makes a difference is that shallow draft, or steamboats that didn't have V-shaped hulls but had shallow hulls, and often double-decker, large steam riverboats, those began to be developed right around 1800, with the most significant river-going steamboat being produced, of all places, Wheeling, West Virginia. Wheeling, West Virginia. And that was the, anybody know? So you offer these things, I guess. So the question is, for bonus point, what was the name of the first ocean, or first river vessel that went upstream from New Orleans to Cincinnati? What was the name of the boat? What was her name? Here, and the year was 1817. She was built in 1816, Wheeling, West Virginia. Anybody have a name? I'll take a stab at it. You don't lose points for this. She was a double-decker, I think stern drive, steamboat. Went from New Orleans to Cincinnati in a mere 25 days. Her name was the Washington. Okay? The Washington. So not the first steamboat, not the first riverboat, but the Washington was the inaugural trip from New Orleans all the way up to Cincinnati. Cincinnati, of course, wasn't really the head of navigation on the Ohio River, but it was a significant location. The falls of the Ohio here are at Louisville, so that's an important obstacle to get around. They would eventually create a canal around the falls, which were just more like rapids than falls. Louisville develops for that bypass around the falls of the Ohio. And Cincinnati, of course, develops as an important river-based location for especially exporting things like corn and pork. Now, how did farmers up here in Ohio in, say, 1815 or 1816, how were they going to ship crops to market? Well, they could certainly ship them down the Ohio, right? But if you wanted to get manufactured goods to Cincinnati, how did you do that? Heck, for that matter, how did you get manufactured goods to Memphis in that period, prior to the arrival of steam vessels that could go upstream? It was a difficult process. You could ship things downriver very easily, right? And this was done with flatboats. Flatboats were just barges. They were just lumber barges. And typically the way it would work would be that, at the end of the summer, when when flour or whatever was moving downstream, they would build these flatboats, load them up, and carefully take them down the Ohio, down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. At New Orleans, everything was offloaded, and the boats were typically scrapped, and the lumber was sold as part of the product. Well, how do you get back to Cincinnati or wherever you may live on the Mississippi once you get to New Orleans? Typically, they would take what's called the Natchez Trace, and it would take them up to from Natchez, Mississippi. You would take this route that generally followed a trail that went to Nashville. So there was a connection between Nashville and Natchez, the Natchez Trace. So that's and you could also go downriver from the the Cumberland, or the Tennessee and the Cumberland as well. Before the flatboat or before the steamboat, you could actually get upriver, but commodities moving upriver were kind of like air freight today, very expensive. The types of boats that they used were called keel boats. Right? Show you some examples. Keel boats. Anybody ever seen a keel boat? No. Keel boats could actually make it upriver. Lewis and Clark, Lewis and Clark, eventually, they left St. Louis and went all the way up, trying to find a passage to the Pacific Ocean. And of course, they got pretty lost up here. But as they were going up the Missouri River, they took a keel boat. And the keel boat was a lot of work. They had to have a lot of labor to move that thing upriver. Here's another map. I'll show this again later when we're talking more about the canals. But this is the National Geographic map of the so-called canal era in the United States. And for some reason, they started 1825. I'm not really sure why that is. I guess it's because of the Erie Canal. The canal era really didn't end in 1860, by the way. It began in 1825. But these are the ones that are most important during that period. You can see that there were, some of the most important ones here is the Erie Canal. Connects the Hudson. There's Albany, and of course, going downstream from the Hudson is New York City. So you can go upstream. Come back. The traffic, of course, is coming from the Great Lakes to the Hudson. Now, cities that you're probably familiar with: Buffalo, maybe not so much Rome, but other cities of Western New York, like Utica, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, those all became important milling cities. So flour milling they were the very first agricultural processing cities based on the development of the wheat belt in this part of the United States. Okay. So let's go over those again. Rochester, let's see. We'll start at Buffalo. And we'll go up the, it doesn't really matter. Utica, Rochester, Syracuse, Rome. Some of the more important milling towns, especially Rochester. Those were the towns that were right on the canal. So that's where they're bringing in wheat from this area, and they would process the wheat into flour, and then that would go to the coast to be distributed to the big cities along the coast and to be shipped across the Atlantic. So milling cities. We're going to talk next week about other canals. One of the more fantastic examples is the canal and rail system that Pennsylvania attempted to develop, and it was called the main line of, I'll save it for you, but it's a canal and railroad system that tried to connect Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, going across a huge area of very rugged terrain. And it was largely a politically driven scheme. And it wasn't very efficient whatsoever. Another one was the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. And this is a really interesting canal that maybe, if you've ever visited Washington, D.C., and you've been to Georgetown, you walk around Georgetown, it's kind of the hoity-toity part of the city, right? But Georgetown actually used to be the end of the line on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. And it was an attempt by people in Washington, D.C. to connect to the Ohio River, or to a tributary of the Ohio River. And the canal went inland, and it went all the way to Cumberland, Maryland. So if you ever fly into Washington, D.C., in fact, from Oklahoma or Dallas or Chicago even, as you fly into Washington, D.C., you can actually see the old Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. So it's a connection to the Chesapeake River from the Potomac. Okay, the Potomac River's here. Connection to the Chesapeake Bay via the Potomac, via the Cumberland River to the Ohio River. So that's the Chesapeake and Ohio. That's really the more important one in the south, although you can see another one down here in what would be Virginia and the James River and Conway Canal. Other attempts at canals, let's see, Pennsylvania, those are the big ones. In the west, the canals tended to be connecting lines between the lakes and the Ohio River, or at least tributaries to the Ohio River. This is also the case with Indiana. So connections to the Ohio River and the Great Lakes through parts of Ohio and Indiana. Okay. So everything's kind of, the area that has the best freight movement early on in American history in the West is this area between the Ohio River and the Great Lakes. Eventually, of course, Chicago would rise up. And because of its distance in the West, Chicago is the entrepot, or the sort of the area that everybody west of Lake Michigan gravitates to. And so Chicago would then develop through this system of Great Lakes and canals, strong connection to New York City. New York and Chicago would develop as the most important big cities after 1860 in the Northeast, and, sort of framing the larger Midwest Northeast region. This takes a lot of dexterity. All right, we've got another set of maps. This is just another example of some canals, early canals. Recently, I visited this part of Ohio, the old Seven Ranges area, and saw some of the early canal developments that were tributary to the upper part of the Ohio River. And on that river, or on those canals, you have mills that collected grain from surrounding farms. Of course, it's on a different scale than what we're used to. Here is a set of maps that shows, and this is from the wonderful atlas, historical atlas, called the C.O. Paulin Atlas, that was done early in the 20th century. And it uses census data, population density for the most part. You know what population density is, right? How do you express population density?
People per square mile.
Yes, the number or the population per square mile or square kilometer, or in the United States it's a square mile. So this is a color-coded, we call it a choropleth map, color-coded map that shows the population per square mile, and I think it's by congressional no, it's not congressional district. It must be county or something. I'm not sure. But, it's a nice series of maps, and it begins here with 1850. So 1850 is kind of on the end of what we're looking at. But this atlas shows you, of course, the highest population densities for the entire country, or the area between, at this point, Washington, D.C. here, Washington, D.C., and then, if you can see it, what city would that be? Philadelphia. So Washington, D.C., well, let's see. I guess that would be Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, and then course, Boston's over here. Right? So Boston to Washington, D.C. today, in the 20th century, that became known as Megalopolis, or Bosnia Wash, or whatever you want to call it. But it's the big axis of population of the United States, the big urban axis of population. And it's already developed in 1850. It's already clear. But look at this. Here's Pittsburgh in 1850, and the area west of Pittsburgh, basically it's Ohio, both eastern and southern Ohio, are really developing in terms of their population density. 45 to 90 people per square mile is fairly settled. The other areas that you can see here are in, the lightest yellow shade is 2 to 18 inhabitants per square mile, 2 to 18 people, settlers per square mile. So you can see that in the South population densities are much lower, right? Population density, however, is even in 1850 beginning to show up as very oriented towards the plantation, the cotton plantation area. So this area that you have from, well, let's see, from about Raleigh, maybe Winston-Salem, North Carolina, on down through this way through basically what is Montgomery, Alabama today, and then sloping back up toward Memphis. That area has a particularly deep organic soil known as the Black Belt. Okay? So the Black Belt of the South is beginning to show up here as a sort of a magnet for cotton plantation settlement. Outside of that region, you would have mostly sparser settlement. Then there were some other areas, like the area around Nashville, Tennessee. Let's see, this would be Nashville, and then a little farther north, the bluegrass region of Kentucky. So the southern areas included some areas with higher population densities by 1850, and that's largely because of their soil productivity. The bluegrass basin and the Nashville basin both had soils based on limestone. Very high quality, high productivity soils that attracted settlement very early in 1790s, 1780s. And other soils in the Black Belt were important as well. You can see also by 1850, settlement into Texas. By 1850, of course, Texas was a state, and the settlement, of course, was focused on, well, a couple of areas. There's old northeast Texas, which was more like the upland South, settled by people generally from Tennessee and Kentucky, and the focus of the old Austin colony from basically maybe Matagorda Bay down here, all the way, including San Antonio in the west, over to Austin, and then Houston, that area. So this whole area of what you might call the greater Houston area is developing by 1850, largely as a cotton plantation area, settled by people from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Okay? Big differences in economy in Texas, even at that time. And I guess I failed to mention, even by 1850, there were a lot of Germans and Czechs coming into the hill country.
Is this, at this time, is it still the Republic of Texas, or is it the
No.
state of Texas?
Texas was annexed in 1845, so it's a state by 1850. Although the census returns probably not that great, I would imagine. Okay, so here are some notes for you. All this is online, so don't worry too much about getting them all verbatim. The Trans-Appalachian settlement, okay, that is Western settlement at this period, was enabled by increasing accessibility. Big word, right? Increasing accessibility. Basically, transport and movement of people people and freight gets easier and cheaper. So settlement is enabled by better and better transportation. Well, what's driving that transportation innovation? Profit motive, okay? For the most part, the transportation framework, the system of transportation that we're looking at is, with only a few exceptions, the product of private enterprise, the product of capitalism. And we'll look at some examples of some sort of politically driven state projects and how they compare with the private enterprise. It's not to say that private enterprise was incredibly efficient and always logical, always rational. And of course, it's always being hit by innovations. But that's what we're interested in here. We're interested in how, over time, these innovations that, were fantastic, wonderful things become outmoded and abandoned, and other things take over. The impact on development and geography is what we're looking at. So the innovations in transporting bulk agricultural commodities. There were innovations in transporting freight. For the most part, we're talking about agricultural type freight. And through the period, there was very uneven accessibility. And because of uneven accessibility, we have what we call, a big buzzword in academia today, uneven development. Okay? Uneven development, as if any development was ever even, right? Which is kind of ludicrous. Of course, development is always uneven. We wouldn't need geography if it wasn't. Okay, so because of uneven accessibility, there's uneven development. What are the most backwards places in the eastern United States? When I say backwards, the boondocks. Where are the places that people get lost and don't come back from? Where are the places that people fear because of the hillbillies or whatever?
West Virginia.
Yeah, the inaccessible places, right? Those are the places that have the most interesting English dialects because isolation, the fact that people haven't gotten out very much, and their distances. And I have nothing against West Virginia because that happens to be the state that has the largest population of people with my last name, all right? So I think my people probably came from there, all right? I know they came from Virginia. Apparently a lot of them stopped in West Virginia and never left. But anyway, the West Virginia is West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, very, very rugged area. Not that great agriculture, so agriculture was not a big draw. Of course, later mining would become very important economic activity. And coal mining is not always going to radically transform the region. Anyway, so innovations in moving commodities. Obviously, there are going to be areas that are winners and areas that are not winners. Right? Now, here's a point regarding moving agricultural commodities, innovations in transporting commodities. Settlement is made profitable by better transport from farms to cities, farms to urban processing centers. Okay? Cities are always going to be either warehousing or industrial centers in the United States. They're trade-oriented places. People come together for a certain reason. So processing centers, these are the magnets for moving things to them. So the settlement is made settlement in the periphery or in the interior is made profitable by increasing the ability for farms to get their goods to the market where they can be sold, or get them to the transportation line where they can be marketed globally. And those places that just don't have that possible accessibility, right, are going to be left behind. They're going to get their development is going to be retarded. Okay, so it's a period when there's a lot of places that are sort of jumping forward and innovating, and they're on the edge of change. And then there are those places that simply because of their location, simply because of their inaccessibility, are just going to be left. I'll give you another example. Not every place in New York is highly accessible. If you go back to that map, you'll see that you go up into on the east of the Hudson Valley. Excuse me, I should say north of the Mohawk Valley and west of the Hudson Valley. North of the Mohawk Valley and west of the Hudson and Lake Champlain. That area right there is a big hole in the population map in 1850. And that's 1850. So what is that region? Mountains, good. Very good answer. Which mountains? Exactly. So this was an area that was largely avoided, largely ignored, because it's kind of like the Ozarks of New York. And Ozarks aren't showing up. Well, maybe a little bit, okay. But it's the Adirondack Mountains. You've ever heard of the Adirondacks, right? The Adirondacks were never really developed until, and they're still not really that developed, there's still a lot of wilderness, but the Adirondacks today are a recreational area. They were one of the first areas where the very wealthy went to get away from the city. And there weren't very many of those places. But by the late 1800s, after the Industrial Revolution, the Adirondacks would begin to open up by rail, and you would get the first, not the very first, but some of the very first resort communities developing in the Adirondacks. First resorts for very wealthy people, to get away from the big city for a while. So sort of, wilderness close to the big cities. The Catskills and Pennsylvania are similar.
Was that where there was that big flood around like 1900, a resort town and killed like a ton of people?
Are you thinking of the Johnstown flood, maybe?
That one,
That's
yeah.
Pennsylvania.
Oh.
Yeah, it was actually more of a mining area. But yeah, it was a real dangerous location for people to live. The dam broke.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, the regions that we're talking about are inaccessible or they're accessible, and these are the ones that are going to be developing. Now, in the case of sort of the physical geography, we've mentioned that, but then we've got this pattern in the South where you've got an overwhelmingly rural pattern of settlement, farm settlement, not big cities, and towns, and courthouse towns and that sort of thing. But when it comes to going somewhere, you go to the river and catch the riverboat to get to New Orleans. So if you're anywhere in the South west of the Appalachians, New Orleans is your metropolis. New Orleans is the place. Right? It's the metropolis of the South, and certainly in 1850. Other metropolises of the South, if you're in Carolinas, would include Charleston, perhaps Savannah to a degree, but Richmond I've mentioned a little bit. But the coastal cities of the South were what people thought of as urban. Certainly New Orleans was the most important location. So let's go back. This. All right, so with uneven development, we get integration of rivers and canals north of the Ohio River. I already showed you this on the map. So the Ohio River is kind of the main street to the eastern part of the country from the Mississippi River. So the Ohio River is the connection to the Middle West from New Orleans. Those canals between the Great Lakes and the Erie Canal system developed mostly in the 1830s. I showed you the map earlier. One thing I didn't mention that we might talk about a little bit more next week is something called the National Road. And it was actually one of the first federal transportation projects undertaken by Congress. And the idea was that it would be an improved road system that would basically follow that area midway between the Great Lakes cities like Cleveland and Erie, Pennsylvania, and the Ohio River cities. So the National Road was intended to link the Ohio River, or central Ohio and even Indiana, with Baltimore. And it was begun around this time. Let's see. Okay. Go back here, I'll point it out on the map. Nope, wrong way. So here's the here's the Ohio River, or Ohio country here, and it was going to connect basically Baltimore, starting at Cumberland, Maryland, actually. It was going to connect these towns, sort of a midway land route between Ohio and eventually Indiana, and we'd make it to Illinois. But the thing about the National Road was it was one of those government projects, and it never was adequately capitalized. It was never adequately funded by Congress because, I'll let you answer that later. Okay. So there were many attempts to connect to the Mississippi River, to connect to the Ohio River, to develop strong connections by canal and river between the eastern cities on the Atlantic coast and the area developing west of the Appalachians. Eventually, we began to see the development of what we'll call trunk line railroads. Trunk line railroads were basically the idea of having an interstate highway type railroad where other railroads could connect into. Trunk line railroad, this was put forth, which might make sense, initially out of Baltimore. So the B&O Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, was begun in 1853, and it would intend to connect Wheeling, West Virginia, okay, to points eastward, primarily to Baltimore. So this trunk line railroad coming out of Baltimore would be one of the first major rail lines. And of course, this rail in 1853 was very, very dangerous and unreliable and very expensive. It took a lot of money, took a lot of investment to get the thing going. So there were some early ones, but we'll see more after the Civil War. Now, some of the results of this stuff, because of uneven accessibility and uneven development, we have the emergence of what we might call intensification of agriculture. Not super specialization yet, but agricultural intensification because of better lands, because of changes in productivity, agricultural practices that increase productivity. And after 1846, the opening up of the British market to American flour. And so 1846 is an important year. Why 1846? Okay, Texas is now a state. What else? It really doesn't have anything to do with the United States, but it has to do with the global economy, right? The developing global economy. And in 1846, England repealed what it called its corn laws. Now in England, what is corn? Well, what do we think of when we think of corn? We think of Nebraska, right? Cornhuskers, right? We think of cornbread and corn cob and corn whiskey and what else? Corn syrup for your cokes, whatever. But that's not what we're talking about. Corn in England is wheat. Okay? Corn is just a name for small grains. So that's a British English American English problem. The corn laws were essentially protectionist laws that England had against the importation of foreign wheat, foreign flour. Why would England have tariffs against the importation of foreign food? Huh?
Trying to use their land.
Thank you very much. Hey, look at this. We got one here. Yeah, you got to catch this now. It's kind of a dangerous scheme I've got going here. All right, so you caught your chip. $10,000. All right, so you have
in cash or?
yeah.
Where?
Las Vegas. $10,000. That's all it says. They're orange. That's why I got them. I didn't hear how much they were. One bonus point. All right. So the idea is like just like the current administration has done by tearing down the Pacific trade deal that we are now not a part of. By tearing that down and then threatening to dismantle NAFTA, and by incorporating tariffs on things like washing machines and solar panels, which happened yesterday, right? The day before. By putting those tariffs on those imported products, what does that do? It does exactly what you mentioned. It protects home industries. In other words, it's going to drive the consumer price up. So I'm sorry, your Philips washing machine price is probably going to go up. But it's a protectionist thing to reduce competition so that the domestic producers, whether they're washing machines, solar panels, or wheat farmers in England, in 1846. In 1846, they did away with these tariffs, they did away with these corn laws. And that meant suddenly, what? The United States in 1846 was like China in 2018. Okay? We were like busting at the seams. We had so much productivity, but we didn't have the market for it. We needed that foreign market. Okay? So they were, we're producing all this agricultural surplus, but the price is depressed because there's not enough of a market for it. So opening up the European markets was a great thing for American farmers. And that would continue to really, foreign trade, sending food to European countries because we could produce it cheaper. Right? Why could we produce it cheaper? We're just better at farming? That's a really good question. That's a rhetorical question. Land was cheap. We didn't pay a lot of taxes. Okay, there weren't a lot of taxes to pay. There certainly weren't the regulations. So it was largely the closest thing that probably we ever had is a free market. So or a non-regulated. So they're producing all this stuff, and with a foreign market out there, wow, that's going to make us more and more profitable, which of course fires up innovation, right? So if you're a farmer and you have, with your 5 sons to do farm labor in Indiana in 1847, okay, and you've got $4 or $5 too, and they're doing their share. The farm work is, something that these boys have to do, but with that amount of labor, you can only work, with maybe two teams of horses and 2 sets of implements. You can maybe only work 100 acres. Yeah, that sounds crazy if you farm today. 100 acres, and that's not all going to be producing an export cash crop. But you're working your hardest to do as much as you possibly can with the amount of labor that you have. The land is cheap. Heck, the land is virtually free. So you don't have a lot of overhead. Labor is what is needed. So with that sudden open market, if you could possibly produce more, you could get little bit, you get by a little bit better. You can produce, get more land easily. It's productivity that needs to change, just like today. So the acreage productivity increases are going to come about because of what? Because of innovation, because of technological innovations for the most part. Those can be very broad. I mean, technological innovations could be changes in crop varieties. They could be new rotation schemes for crops. Certainly, we tend to think of machines, right? Machines that are innovations, and that's something that happens as well. But transport innovations are often the big cap on productivity. Wouldn't make any more sense to produce more if it's all going to rot. You can't get it to market fast enough. So agricultural intensification increases foreign exports, especially after 1846. So from 1810 to 1860, we see this growth in the rural population, settler farmer population, and the Trans-Appalachian population increase. Just some figures here. Before 1815, the 1810 census, you've got about 14% of the entire United States population living west of the Appalachian Mountains. So think about it. And that's mostly in, places like Pennsylvania, maybe New York, for the most part in 1810. 14% of the United States population in 1810. By 1860, you got 40%. So basically the West is growing spectacularly. So 40% of the United States population west of the Appalachians in 1860. So let's talk about the South. What's going on in the South in 1860 in terms of transportation? Because of the predominance of canals or river transport, the predominance of rural settlement, plantation settlement, lack of cities, lack of need to market agricultural goods in cities and to process them in cities. Most of the rail system that existed prior to the Civil War were what we call tributary rail lines that were pretty much moving things to the river ports. There weren't very many of these at all. So the rail lines that did exist were connecting plantation areas, as in the Black Belt of Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia. We connect those to rivers like in Mississippi, the Pearl River that went down to the Gulf. Or in Tennessee, they connected to the Tennessee River or the Cumberland River in Kentucky and Tennessee. And so those rivers were, those were the ways to ship things out and bring things in. The rail transport was very tributary. Here are some of the main river ports that connected to plantation regions. Memphis, of course, West Tennessee on the Mississippi River, but also connecting, largely connecting to the Mississippi Delta to the south. A major cotton production region. Louisville, along what river? Mentioned it earlier. On the Ohio River. And why Louisville? Why was Louisville there? Because of the falls of the Ohio, right? Montgomery, Alabama. Okay. Right in the Black Belt of Alabama. On the what river? Nashville, on what river? It's on the Cumberland River. And Chattanooga, on the Tennessee River. Chattanooga, southeastern Tennessee. And so those were the places that had rail connections. In Tennessee, for example, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad was very important. We think if you're from Oklahoma and Texas, what is the historical railroad of those two states. What do you think?
Santa Fe.
The Katy, for the most part, the KT Railroad, Kansas, Texas, and maybe the Santa Fe. The Santa Fe, the largest system. The earliest railroad was the Katy Railroad that came through. Anyway, these are some of the major port or railroad connections to those. There were some exceptions, and those were the rail lines that were competing with river routes to move cotton from the interior of the Gulf seaports like what? In Texas? Galveston, okay? Galveston, old city on coastal Texas. But there were some rail lines that were connecting Gulf seaports to inland cities like New Orleans, Mobile, or Houston. All right, so those were the exceptions. And in terms of the South, the cotton economy was directed, the development, because of the cotton economy, was non-integrated and highly decentralized. And that's where we'll pick up next time.